Isaiah loses his way and discovers the Coffin, the Arizona territory, in 1879 could swallow a man whole without leaving a trace, and Isaiah Thorne knew it better than most. Still, even he hadn't meant to wander this far off the trail. The morning sun was already burning a white line along the horizon, and the wind was carrying dust in low, restless swirls across the empty plain like it had a mind to bury every sign of the past. His horse's hooves crunched over dry earth, the sound muted by the wide, aching silence that stretched in every direction. He was bound for Yuma, chasing down a whisper of a lead on a stolen mare, one worth enough to make the detour from his own business. But the storm that tore through the territory the night before had turned the low creek bed into a churning wash and taken the road with it. He'd followed a higher ridge, keeping the sun at his shoulder, and somehow ended up here staring at the broken fence line of a place no cattle had roamed in years. The land past that fence looked forgotten, grass burned to brittle stalks, weeds clawing up through cracked soil, a few warped fence posts leaning toward the ground as though they'd given up. And just beyond, against the sagging shape of what might once have been a churchyard, something caught his eye. At first it was nothing but a pale, crooked shape in the dirt, half swallowed by tumbleweed. Then, as his horse drew closer, the shape took form, a pine-wood box, the kind he'd seen too many times before, tilted at an angle, like the ground had pushed it back up in rejection. Isaiah reined in the leather, creaking under his grip. The air seemed to thicken around him. He swung down from the saddle boots, sinking into dry tufts of grass, and approached, slow scanning the emptiness for any other sign of life. The box's lid was split, the boards warped from sun and neglect. He'd buried enough men to know a coffin when he saw one. This one, though, hadn't been buried right, not deep enough, not covered proper. Something about it snagged hard in his chest. The wind hissed through the fence rails as he crouched, running a hand over the dusty lid. The wood shifted beneath his palm softly, like it moved on its own. Isaiah froze, pulse pounding in his ears. Then it came again, faint but undeniable, a rattle of air, a breath too weak to be made by anything but the living. Every instinct in him snapped sharp. He shoved the weeds aside, clearing the lid fingers, digging into the narrow gap in the boards. The smell of dry earth and pine rose up, mingled with something human. Sweat, fear, the raw scent of skin that had been too long without light. His heart hammered as he pried at the lid, the old nails squealing against the strain until the boards gave with a splintering crack. The shadowed space inside yawned open, and for a beat he thought his eyes were playing tricks. Curled inside like a fox trapped in a snare was a woman. Her dress was torn and smeared with dirt, her lips tinged blue skin, pale enough to look carved from stone. Fingers scraped raw showed where she'd clawed at the wood, desperate. Her chest rose in a shallow, trembling breath, and Isaiah felt something cold and hot all at once grip his spine. This wasn't a corpse abandoned to the earth. This was someone who had been put here alive, rescuing the woman from the coffin. For a long heartbeat, Isaiah didn't move. The sight rooted him, this fragile, dirt-streaked figure crammed into a space no living soul should ever know. Her hair, tangled and matted with dust, clung to her damp temples. Each breath she managed was a small rebellion, a thin sound like wind whistling through a cracked window. Then her eyelids flickered, and two pale green eyes looked up at him from the darkness. The raw scrape of her voice seemed to tear the air between them. Isaiah, you came. The words hit him harder than a rifle butt. He staggered back a step as if the force of them had landed in his chest. She knew his name when no one for miles around had reason to. For a second, he wondered if this was some ghost called up from the red dust. But her breath steamed faintly in the cool morning, and ghosts didn't do that. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, already leaning forward again. You're alive. His hands worked fast, peeling away the last tangle of weeds and pushing the lid wide enough to get both arms inside. She was so light, he half expected her to vanish as he lifted her. Her limbs slack, her head rolling toward his shoulder. The heat of her skin was uneven cold in places, fever warm in others. Her heart fluttered against his chest like a bird fighting a snare. He stepped back from the grave-shaped hollow boots crunching in the dry grass and lowered her onto the patch of earth nearest the fence where the sun fell strongest. The wind pulled at the torn hem of her dress. She shook in short, violent bursts, her teeth chattering, her hands clenching at nothing. Without thinking, Isaiah stripped off his duster, the heavy canvas still warm from his own body, and wrapped it around her. He tugged the lapels close under her chin, feeling her breath tick against his knuckles. "What is your name?" he asked, leaning close so she didn't have to strain to hear. Her lips moved, the sound just a whisper, rasped raw. "Adalline." Her gaze didn't leave his face. Then after a breath, Adalline rose. The name sent a faint, half-forgotten jolt through him, a picture flashing behind his eyes, wild hair catching the sun, bare feet pounding through wheat stubble near San Carlos, the laugh of a girl he had once chased through the tall grass. He swallowed the edges of the memory sharper than he expected. "You—" He crouched lower, searching her face. "You were at the reservation school." She nodded, and a tear slid down her dirt-streaked cheek. "You gave me your apple when I had nothing to eat. You were the only one who was kind." Isaiah felt his throat tighten. He remembered now. She had been just a girl, then sent west after her parents died in the war. He'd been 12, she 10. That summer had ended, and so had their paths crossing until now here with her pulled from a coffin like some grim miracle. "Who did this to you?" he asked, brushing a damp strand of hair back from her forehead. Her eyes closed briefly. "They thought I was dead," she whispered. "But I wasn't. I woke up in the dark." Her voice cracked, the words trembling apart. "Who?" he pressed gently. "Sheriff's men," she said at last. "Someone paid them. I saw faces. I don't know why." Her voice broke, and she turned her face into his palm as if to hide from the memory. Isaiah's jaw clenched. He'd seen cruelty before, but this was evil with a personal edge. He stood abruptly, scanning the horizon like he could see the men responsible, and then bent to gather her in his arms again. "We're getting you out of here." He said the words, steady, final. Connection from the past. Isaiah held her as if she might slip away again if he loosened his grip, her weight slight against him, though her presence seemed to press against every part of his chest. He moved back toward his horse, each step deliberate over the uneven ground, careful not to jar her too much. The saddle creaked when he set her down sideways, his duster still wrapped around her narrow frame. She leaned into him without hesitation, her forehead brushing the hollow of his collarbone, her breath uneven but steadier than before. That name, Adalline Rose, kept rolling in his head, dredging up images from years he'd half buried under dust and long miles. He could see the sharp July sunlight over San Carlos, hear the shouts of boys at play, and there she was, barefoot, legs pumping as she tore through a field of tall wheat, laughing like she owned the wind. She'd been smaller than the other children at the reservation school, thin from too many missed meals, but there had been something fierce in the way she carried herself. He remembered the day her stomach had growled loud enough for the teacher to look up. She'd sat still, her gaze fixed on the floor. At lunch, Isaiah had split the only apple he had in his pocket, pushing the larger half into her hand without a word. She'd looked at him, then those same green eyes, bright with something beyond gratitude, and said, "You're the only one who sees me." It was a thing he'd carried without meaning to tucked away with other fragments of a childhood that had ended too soon. Now, years later, she was here, pulled from the earth itself, saying his name like a tether to life. He swung into the saddle behind her, one arm firm around her waist, and turned his horse toward the barely visible line of red mesa in the distance. The wind cut at them, pulling loose strands of her hair into his face, but she didn't complain. Her hands fisted in his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to erase her. As they rode, he felt her head lift slightly. "You were buried alive," he said quietly, not wanting to hear it, but needing the truth spoken. His voice carried the grit of the trail, but beneath it was something harder, an oath forming. "Yes," she murmured. "They thought I was dead. I woke up in the dark, couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. I thought maybe I was already gone." "Sheriff's men." He repeated, his tone flattening into a kind of calm that usually came before violence. "And someone paid them." Her nod was small, but it was enough. Isaiah stared out over the empty span ahead, the sun throwing long shadows across the dry plain. He'd chased thieves, hunted killers, seen what men could do for money, or out of spite, but this was different. This was personal, and it felt like the land itself was pushing him toward whatever reckoning waited in Dry Fork. He adjusted his hold on her, his hand covering hers where it gripped his shirt. "No one's going to find you out here," he said, his voice steady, meant to anchor her. "Not unless we want them to." She didn't answer, but the way her shoulders eased against him told him she believed it. The first night at the cabin, by the time Isaiah guided the horse into the narrow cut that led toward his cabin, the sun had already begun its slow slide behind the jagged cliffs of Red Mesa. The air grew cooler there, shadows stretching long across the scrub and rock. His place wasn't much a single-room cabin with a lean-to shed and a corral half falling into itself, but it was far enough from any road or settlement to be invisible to curious eyes. That was what mattered. He swung down first the boards of the porch, creaking under his boots, then reached up to take Adalline in his arms again. She was lighter than she looked, and he felt the faint tremor in her limbs, even through the thick folds of his duster. Inside the cabin smelled faintly of cedar, and the ashes from the last fire he'd left banked. He carried her to the bed against the far wall, a narrow frame built by his own hands with a quilt folded over it, and lowered her gently. The flicker of firelight from the hearth caught in her eyes as she blinked up at him, the green dulled by exhaustion but still searching his face. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of dirt-clumped hair back from her forehead. "You're safe now," he said, and meant it. Her lips parted, her voice still hoarse from thirst. "Why? Why did you come?" Isaiah hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire for a long moment before he answered. "I don't know. Wasn't supposed to be near that place today, but I'm glad I was." Something softened in her eyes, and she gave the faintest smile, the corners of her mouth barely lifting. "You saved me." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and the vow came out as steady as if he'd carved it into stone. The fire built slowly, the crackle of wood filling the quiet between them. He moved to the small table, fetched a tin cup of water, and brought it back to her. She sipped her fingers, brushing his, and the tremor in her hand seemed to ease. By the time she lay back, her breathing had grown more, even the sharp lines of fear loosening from her face. Isaiah sat in the chair beside the bed long after her eyes closed, the weight of the day heavy, but not enough to drive him from his post. Outside, the wind slipped around the corners of the cabin, but inside, the air stayed still, steady warm. 3 days of recovery. The next morning she woke to the scent of coffee and the low pop of the fire. Isaiah was by the hearth, sleeves rolled to his elbows, stirring something over the flames. His hat hung from the peg near the door, and the easy, deliberate way he moved told her he had been up for hours. She pushed herself upright slowly, a tug of pain along her ribs making her wince. The movement must have caught his attention. He turned fast, setting the pan aside. "You need to lie back," he said, crossing the floor. She shook her head. "I need to know what happened." He crouched beside her again the same way he had the night before. "We'll figure it out, but first you need food. Water. Time." His gaze was steady, but she could feel him measuring every word, weighing how much she could handle. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was real or another trick of the dark. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. Isaiah's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping for just a breath before he answered. "Because no one helped my mother when she needed it. She died alone. I swore I'd never let that happen to someone again." Her fingers reached for his hand, without thinking, curling lightly over his. "You're not the boy I remember," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "And you're not the girl I remember either." That was how it began, 3 days marked by slow healing and careful talk. She told him the pieces she could bear, to speak aloud, how she'd come west with a preacher's wife looking for work, how she'd taken a job teaching children in a mining town, and how she'd stepped between the preacher's son and a young girl he'd cornered. Then one night she'd fallen sick, or so she thought. Her last memory before the darkness was the press of a handkerchief to her face and a sweet, choking smell. "The next thing I knew," she whispered, "I woke in a box." Isaiah listened without interrupting, though she could see the muscle jump in his jaw. When she said she didn't know exactly who wanted her gone, but suspected someone had paid for it, he rose and began pacing. "Do you remember which town? Dry Fork," she said quietly. He nodded once. "I'll ride there tomorrow. Ask questions." Her hand caught his before he could turn away. "Don't go alone." He looked down at her, then slowly sat back beside her. "You're not safe here alone either." "Then take me with you." His brows lifted. "You just got out of a coffin." She smiled soft, but there was iron under it. "And I'm not going back in." Isaiah felt something shift in his chest at that. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed hearing someone laugh until it came from her. "All right," he said at last. "We ride at dawn." The journey to Dry Fork dawn came sharp and pale, the kind of light that didn't warm, but made every shadow stretch farther than it should. Isaiah had been up before first light, checking the saddles, tightening straps, and making sure both rifles were cleaned and loaded. The horses shifted restlessly in the cool air, breath clouding in slow bursts. Adalline stepped out from the cabin wrapped in one of his spare coats, the collar turned high against her neck. Her hair was pinned back from her face, though a few loose strands caught the wind. She carried her own rifle cradled across her lap as she mounted, but he noticed the faint tremor in her fingers on the stock. He didn't mention it's some things you let settle on their own. They set out at a steady pace, the trail narrowing into a crease between low sandstone ridges. Isaiah kept his eyes moving, scanning behind them as often as ahead. The land here could hide a man on horseback until he was close enough to smell your sweat. Adalline stayed quiet for the first hour, her gaze fixed on the uneven horizon. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just careful. Then, as the canyon walls began to widen, she spoke without looking at him. "Do you believe in signs?" Isaiah glanced at her, his brow creasing under the brim of his hat. "Depends on the day." Her voice stayed low, the words shaped more for herself than for him. "I heard a whippoorwill when I woke in that box. There shouldn't have been one out there, not in that heat. But it was singing. Maybe it flew low to warn you," he offered, half serious, half trying to ease the tightness in her voice. She turned her head enough to meet his gaze for a beat. "Or to call someone." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Some things weren't meant to be dismissed with a shrug. By midday, the canyon opened into wide, blanched flats, dotted with mesquite and the occasional dark lump of lava rock. The wind pressed at their backs, carrying with it the faint tang of dust from somewhere far off. Isaiah pointed ahead where a scatter of low buildings clung to the edge of the plain like they were afraid of sliding off into nothing. "Dry Fork," he said. The town wasn't much, just a handful of structures huddled around a dry well and a crooked telegraph pole. On the north end, a saloon leaned into the wind like it was about to give up, while the sheriff's office squatted beside a feed store with shutters drawn against the glare. A lone dog barked once from behind a fence, and then went silent. They swung around the back of the livery stable where the smell of hay and horses was thick enough to cut the trail dust from their throats. Isaiah tied both mounts in the shade and motioned toward the main street. "We'll start with the general store." Inside, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of flour and lamp oil. The man behind the counter was thin as a fence rail, jaw wide and hair graying at the temples, his white suspenders crossing a faded shirt. He gave Isaiah a quick nod. "Help you, stranger." Isaiah stepped closer, his voice even. "Looking for a girl used to teach the miners' children out near the ridge. Preacher's wife brought her in. Might have gone by Adalline Rose." The man scratched his chin. Pretty little thing, green eyes. Quiet. Isaiah gave one slow nod. "Thought she died," the man continued. "Fever took her fast. They buried her 2 days later. Whole town heard about it. Shame, too. Kids liked her." Isaiah's jaw tightened once before he asked, "Who buried her? Sheriff's boys, I reckon." "Didn't see it myself." The man leaned on the counter, looking curious now. "You a kin old friend?" Before Isaiah could answer, Adalline stepped forward, her face pale but steady. "Do you remember who sent for the coffin?" The man blinked at her sudden presence. "Ma'am, do you remember?" she repeated, firmer this time. He looked between them, then nodded slowly. "Was the undertaker from Yuma, but the preacher's son paid for it. Real insistent, too. Had it sent out same day she took sick." Isaiah's eyes narrowed, the pieces falling into place. "Where's this preacher's son now?" "Stays in the boarding house up the hill, runs collections on Sundays. Preaches when his father's traveling." Adaline's mouth pressed into a flat line. He tried to touch one of the girls. I told his father. Next day I woke up in the dark. Isaiah's hand found hers on the counter, steady and solid. She didn't pull away, finding and confronting Illy Mercer. They left the store without another word, the door creaking shut behind them as the sunlight flared off the dusty main street. Isaiah cut a path around the back of the livery stable, keeping to the shaded side where the heat wasn't quite so brutal. The boarding house stood halfway up the hill, a 2-story frame with lace curtains in the windows and white paint peeling soft at the corners. A rain barrel sat by the porch, catching the runoff from a sagging gutter. Adalline stayed low behind the barrel, while Isaiah mounted the porch steps. The boards groaned under his weight. He knocked once firm enough to carry through the door, but not so hard as to bring half the house to watch. It opened to reveal a woman with gray-streaked hair tucked under a kerchief and a flour-dusted apron stretched over her front. She looked him over with the quick, practiced eyes of someone who knew how to size a man in 3 seconds. "Rooms are full," she said before he could speak. "I'm looking for a man named Mercer. Illy Mercer." Her eyes narrowed a fraction. "You the law." "No," Isaiah replied, the single syllable steady as stone. "Just need to ask him about a coffin." That made her pause. She shifted her weight, then stepped aside. Top of the stairs. Second door. Isaiah's boots made no sound on the stair treads. The hall smelled faintly of lamp oil and boiled cabbage. He found the door and tried the handle unlocked. Inside, a man hunched over a desk pen, scratching across paper, a Bible open beside his elbow. "You Mercer, Isaiah?" asked, stepping inside. Mercer looked up, startled. "That's right." I don't know what Isaiah closed the distance in 2 strides, catching the front of Mercer's shirt and slamming him back against the wall hard enough to rattle the desk. His forearm pressed up under the man's chin, cutting off the rest of his words. "You ordered a coffin for a woman who wasn't dead." Mercer's face went white. "I don't know what you've been told." "She woke up," Isaiah growled, leaning in. Mercer's hands fluttered against his arm. I swear I only did what I was told." "By who, my father?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "He said it would ruin us if word got out. He said she was already gone." Isaiah stepped back just enough for the man to breathe. "You drugged her." Mercer sagged against the wall, coughing. "He gave me the powder. I didn't know it wouldn't kill her." From the doorway, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "But you buried me anyway." Mercer froze. His gaze jerked toward Adalline, who stood framed in the hall's dim light, her eyes cold and unshaken. "She's supposed to be dead," he stammered. Isaiah drew his revolver, the metallic click loud in the quiet. "She isn't." Forcing the confession, Adalline stepped into the room, her boots quiet on the worn floorboards. She stopped just short of Mercer's desk, her hands steady at her sides. "You're going to write a letter," she said. "You'll tell the governor exactly what your father did, and you'll put your name on it." Mercer's mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes flicked from her to Isaiah, gauging his chances. "If I do that, they'll hang him." "Then let them," Adalline replied, her voice unwavering. Mercer's Adam's apple bobbed. "You don't understand. I understand better than you think," she cut in. "You left me in the dark to die. You thought my life was worth less than your father's shame." Isaiah kept the revolver steady, his voice low, but leaving no room for argument. "Sit down. Write." Mercer hesitated 1 beat too long, and Isaiah took a step forward, the barrel angling closer. That was enough. Mercer stumbled to the desk, pulled a clean sheet of paper from the stack, and dipped his pen. The scratch of nib on parchment filled the room uneven at first, then steady as Isaiah dictated the key details. Names dates the undertaker in Yuma, the sheriff's men. Every word was inked in Mercer's own hand. When the last line was done, Adalline stepped forward, reading it over his shoulder. Her gaze was hard, but her voice was quiet when she said, "Sign it." Mercer's signature shook, but held legible. Isaiah took the page, folded it twice, and slipped it into his coat. "We'll make sure it gets where it needs to go." Mercer slumped in his chair, his hands limp in his lap as though the fight had drained from him entirely. Adalline stared at him for a moment longer, as if committing his face to memory, then turned toward the door without another word. They left Dry Fork under the cover of night, the moon a sharp silver sliver above them. The trail out of town was quiet, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled in the sand. When they stopped at a creek to water the mounts, Adalline stood beside Isaiah, her eyes on the sweep of stars overhead. "You believed me," she said. "I never doubted," he answered, still watching the sky. "You could have," she murmured. "Would have made things easier." "Most things worth doing aren't easy," he said. She stepped closer. "What happens now?" Isaiah turned his gaze to hers. "Whatever you want." Her fingers found his hand. "I want to go home," she said. "Wherever that is." He tightened his grip. "Then we'll build one." Returning to the cabin, the land east of Dry Fork stretched out in a long unbroken ribbon of pale dust and greasewood, the kind of country that kept its secrets in plain sight. Isaiah kept them at a steady trot, his eyes scanning the horizon in slow, deliberate sweeps. He didn't expect anyone from Dry Fork to follow. They didn't have the stomach to chase a truth that ugly. But he also knew fear made people do foolish things. Adalline rode beside him, her posture straight despite the fatigue still etched in her shoulders. The wind tugged at the edges of his spare coat around her, carrying the scent of mosquito and the faint tang of rain far to the south. They didn't speak much during the ride back. The quiet wasn't uneasy anymore. It had settled into something that felt familiar, like the hush before a storm that never comes. Every so often, Isaiah glanced her way, and she would meet his gaze just long enough to make him think she was taking the same measure of him. By the second evening, Red Mesa's cliffs rose ahead, red stone catching the last of the sun. When they turned down the narrow cut toward his cabin, Isaiah's eyes caught on the porch. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. His hand slid to the rifle tied behind his saddle, and he motioned for her to hold back. They dismounted in silence. Isaiah eased the door open, stepping inside first. The air was still the only sound, the faint creak of the rafters. A quick scan told him nothing had been touched. The saddlebags sat where he'd left them, the kindling stacked neat in the corner, the hearth cold but clean. He set the rifle down, tension unwinding by degrees. Adalline stepped inside after him, her shoulders loosening when she saw everything as it had been. She crossed to the window, pulling the curtain closed with a quick flick. "You think they'll come looking?" she asked. "No," Isaiah said, unbuckling his gun belt. "But we'll be careful all the same." She turned from the window, studying him with a seriousness that made the air between them feel heavier. "I don't want to live in fear." "You won't," he answered without hesitation. She walked toward him slowly, stopping close enough that he could see the fine dust still caught in her hair. "You said we'd build something." "I meant it." The silence that followed didn't ask to be filled. She reached for his hand, pressing her palm against his. "I don't want to leave." "You don't have to," he said, and when she lowered her forehead to his chest, he rested his hand on the back of her head, steady as bedrock. Days of quiet work. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mornings began with the light spilling over the ridge, the air cool enough to make their coffee steam in the tin cups. Isaiah repaired the section of roof where the last storm had torn. Shingles loose, his hammer ringing against the nails in a slow, steady cadence. Adalline took to the patch of ground behind the shed, turning the soil with a rusted spade until her palms blistered, then planting neat rows of beans and corn. She moved with purpose, as though every seed she pressed into the earth was another stake driven into the life they were making. In the evenings they sat by the fire, the space between them no longer uncertain. Sometimes Isaiah read aloud from the worn book the old army chaplain had once given him, his voice low, and even while Adalline mended clothes or carved slender shavings from a piece of cedar just for the smell of it. Other nights the only sounds were the pop of the logs and the wind in the cottonwoods outside. One morning she returned from the garden with dirt smudged across her cheek and a feather tucked behind her ear. "There's a spring behind the ridge," she announced, setting a pail of water down by the door. "Clean and cold as anything." Isaiah looked up from the saddle he was mending. "You found it." She nodded, eyes bright with the small victory. "I want to build a trough, maybe keep a few goats." He set his tools aside and stood. "Then we'll build it." That evening they sat on the porch with the sun sinking low, her head resting against his shoulder. The land stretched out before them in long waves of gold and shadow, and for the first time in a long time Isaiah realized he wasn't thinking about who might be coming down the trail. "You know," she said, voice almost a whisper. "I don't miss the sound of bell towers or train whistles." "I don't miss the road," he replied. She tilted her head to look at him, her eyes calm but sure. "I want to marry you." Isaiah didn't speak right away. He reached for her hand, turned it in his own, and kissed her knuckles gently. "I was waiting for the right time to ask," he said. She laughed softly and pressed her lips to his cheek. "Now's right." They married under the cottonwoods behind the cabin, just the two of them, a Bible between their hands and the wind in their hair. Isaiah wore his cleanest shirt. Adalline wore a blue ribbon she'd found at the bottom of her old satchel. When they stepped back inside that evening, the door closing behind them with a soft click, it felt like the land itself had let out a long, satisfied breath. The rainy season and the letter from Prescott. The rains came late that year, rolling in from the south with a heaviness that soaked the ground and slowed the mornings. For days on end, a gray curtain hung over Red Mesa, blurring the line between the ridge and the sky. The air smelled of wet cedar, and the roof drummed with a steady rhythm that worked its way into everything. Isaiah patched leaks where the new shingles had warped, while Adalline laid oilcloth beneath the windows to keep the water from pooling on the floor. The damp seeped into their clothes and their bones, but inside the cabin the fire burned warm and constant. On the 5th morning of rain, Isaiah was out by the shed, sawing planks from a fallen juniper he'd hauled in before the storm. His shirt clung to his back, dark with sweat despite the chill. Adalline crossed the muddy yard with a kettle in one hand, her boots sinking into the softened earth. "You'll ruin your arm working in this," she called over the rain, holding out his tin cup. He took it without looking up, his eyes still on the cut in the board. Nearly through. Just needs the brace fitted. She watched him for a moment, then crouched by the scrap pile and pulled out a smaller board. If we cut this down, it could hold the hinge steady. Isaiah glanced at her, rain tracking down his jaw. You figuring on building now? No, she said, setting the board aside, just helping. They worked together until the light shifted and the rain softened to a mist. By the time the brace held in place, both of them were damp through their boots, heavy with mud. Isaiah ran a hand along the new frame, gave one satisfied nod, and led the way inside. That evening, as the fire dried their boots by the hearth, Adalline pulled something from the lining of her satchel, a folded piece of paper worn soft at the edges. She opened it carefully, revealing faded ink in a handwriting that still carried a careful grace. "My sister's in Prescott," she said, holding it out. "I haven't seen her since before the war." Isaiah took the letter, scanning the address. "You want to find her. I want her to know I'm alive." Adalline replied, her voice low but steady. He folded the paper back along its old creases and handed it to her. "We'll ride out when the ground firms." She hesitated. "I don't want to bring her here." "Not yet. But if she's safe, it might be enough." "She'll want to see your face," Isaiah said. Adalline slipped the letter back into its place, her fingers lingering on the worn paper. "I don't know what she'll want. We were different even as girls. She stayed when I left with the preacher's wife. I never wrote her back after the first year." Isaiah didn't press. He simply reached across the table and touched the edge of her hand. The rain tapped against the roof, steady as a heartbeat, and the firelight painted her profile in warm gold. 3 days later, the skies cleared, and the smell of mesquite and wet stone rose from the ground. At dawn, they saddled the horses. Isaiah strapped his rifle to the saddle, while Adalline wrapped herself against the wind, the letter tucked safe in her coat. The trail to Prescott ran through higher country, the hills stitched with pinyon pine and tall grass. Mule deer bounded away at the sound of hooves, white tails flashing before vanishing into the trees. They stopped before sundown, beneath a notch of red cliffs, clearing a space for the fire. Adalline unrolled their blankets without being asked, her hands sure despite the long ride. She warmed her palms by the flames, her eyes far away. "I dreamed of a porch swing," once she said softly. "One that didn't creak, just moved with a breeze." Isaiah stirred the coals. "Wood's easy. We'll make one." She smiled faintly without looking at him. "I used to think I needed people all around me." Laughter, voices, motion. "Now I think I just needed someone to stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The next day they would reach Prescott and the woman who knew her before the dark. The reunion in Prescott came into view under a sky washed clean by the recent rains, the town humming with the movement of freight wagons and the clatter of hooves on its main street. The air smelled faintly of pine from the hills and of coal smoke curling up from chimneys. Isaiah slowed his horse as they passed a row of storefronts, blacksmiths, forge, feed store, mercantile, until Adaline's gaze locked on a narrow window dressed with lace collars and muslin dresses pinned to wooden forms. Above the door, a small painted sign read, "Ruth's Sewing Room." She sat very still in the saddle for a moment, her gloved hands tightening on the reins. "That's her shop," she murmured. Isaiah looked at the sign, then back at her. "You sure, yes?" Her voice was quiet but certain. They dismounted at the hitch rail. Adalline smoothed the front of her coat, pinning back a loose strand of hair with fingers that betrayed the slightest tremor. She hesitated on the boardwalk, her eyes fixed on the glass, as if she were staring through time itself. "She might not forgive me," she said almost to herself. Isaiah stepped closer, his voice low. "You're not the girl who left. She'll see that." The bell above the door chimed when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pressed fabric and fresh wood polish. Behind the counter stood a woman with dark hair braided neatly over one shoulder, a pair of sewing shears in her hand. She looked up, and for a moment her expression was nothing but polite curiosity. Then her mouth parted slightly, the scissors lowering to the counter. "Addie," she breathed. Adalline nodded once. "Hello, Ruth?" For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Ruth came around the counter, her steps quickening until she reached her sister. The embrace was stiff at first arms, cautious, but it shifted into something tighter, the years between them collapsing under the weight of shared blood. Neither spoke for a long moment. Only the quiet hum of the street outside filled the space. Isaiah stepped back, letting the door swing shut behind him. He found a place against the porch rail outside, watching the steady pass of wagons and hearing faintly the low murmur of the sisters' voices through the glass. An hour passed before Adalline stepped out again. Her eyes were rimmed red, but her posture was straighter, her chin lifted. "She's married now," Adalline said, falling into step beside him. "A man who runs freight down to Tucson. They've got 2 boys." He nodded. "She's glad you're alive." "Yes, but she asked why I never wrote." Adaline's voice held a raw edge, but there was no bitterness. "I told her the truth." "You want to stay a few days?" he asked. "No," she said without hesitation. "I want to go home." They mounted up again before the sun had dipped far. The air was crisp, the road out of town climbing into the low hills. Adaline's coat was buttoned to her throat, the letter from Ruth tucked deep into her pocket. As they crested a ridge, Isaiah reached over, brushing his fingers against hers on the reins. She turned her head toward him. "I didn't know people could make you feel found again." He didn't answer with words, just kept her hand in his until the trail dipped out of the light. Homecoming and plans for the future. The ride back to Red Mesa felt different than the ride out, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The air was clear, washed of dust by the rains, and the hills held that crisp, clean scent that comes only after a storm has wrung the land dry. Adalline rode steady, her back straight despite the ache. She didn't name her eyes, fixed ahead as though the cabin itself were pulling her home. Isaiah stayed close, his gaze moving between the trail and the woman beside him, measuring the subtle changes in her since they'd left. By the second evening, the familiar shape of the ridge came into view. The sun was low when they turned into the narrow cut, the golden light spilling across the front of the cabin. The door was ajar again, swaying faintly with the wind. But this time Isaiah saw it for what it was, just a careless draft, nothing more. Still, he dismounted, first stepping inside to make sure. The air was cool and undisturbed, the saddlebags still stacked neatly, the hearth untouched. He felt the knot in his chest loosen as he set his rifle back on its pegs. Adalline followed him in her boots, whispering over the worn floorboards. She went straight to the window, pulling the curtain closed with a practiced motion, and then turned to face him. "You think anyone will come looking?" she asked. "No," Isaiah said, his voice certain. "Not after what they know we're willing to do. But—" He met her eyes. Fear makes folks foolish. We'll stay ready." She nodded, then crossed the room to stand in front of him. Her coat still smelled faintly of pine and rain. "I don't want to live in fear," she said quietly. "You won't," he answered without hesitation or flourish, just the plain truth the way he always spoke, when it mattered most. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like she was weighing the next words. "You said we'd build something. I want to start." He felt the faintest tug at the corner of his mouth. "Then we will." For a moment, neither moved. Then she reached for his hand, pressing her palm into his until their fingers interlaced. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said, his voice low but steady. She lowered her forehead to his chest, and he rested his palm on the back of her head, feeling the soft weight of her there. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, but inside the air felt anchored. That night, they ate a simple supper by the fire, beans and cornbread coffee strong enough to chase the last of the road dust from their throats. Isaiah repaired a leather strap, while Adalline sat nearby, darning a tear in one of his shirts. Every so often, she glanced up at him, not to speak, but simply to watch the way the firelight caught in his profile. Later, as they stepped out onto the porch, the land lay quiet under a sky scattered with stars. She looked out toward the dark line of the ridge and said, "I want to add a room to the cabin. There's enough space if we shift the cot and tear out that back panel." Isaiah leaned against the post, arms crossed. "You thinking to draw the plans and let me swing the hammer?" Her eyes flicked to his. Both, she said, a hint of challenge in her tone. He nodded, once slow. "Then we start when the ground dries." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt like the beginning of something that had already taken root, building the life they imagined. Spring settled in with a patience that matched the pace of their days, each one unfolding into the next without hurry. The ground dried and warmed, and true to his word, Isaiah began cutting the timbers for the new room. The sound of his saw and hammer became a steady heartbeat in the yard, carrying across the slope to where Adalline worked in the garden. She had coaxed green shoots from the earth, beans, corn, and a scatter of herbs in a bed by the porch. Each row was straight and deliberate, the work of someone planting more than food. She was planting permanence. Isaiah framed the walls, first the scent of fresh-cut pine mixing with the tang of soil turned under her spade. When he hoisted the first beam into place, Adalline steadied the ladder for him, her face tipped up into the sun. They worked without needing to speak, much passing tools, checking angles, measuring twice before cutting. Sweat streaked the dust on their skin, but neither complained. The work wasn't about speed, it was about making it right. Evenings belonged to the porch. They'd sit with the last light bleeding from the horizon, sharing coffee, or simply listening to the wind comb through the cottonwoods. Sometimes she'd read aloud from the chaplain's book, her voice threading through the hum of crickets. Other nights, Isaiah would whittle small shapes from scraps of wood birds, a coil of rope, the beginnings of a toy horse, his knife strokes slow and sure. One afternoon, Adalline returned from the ridge behind the cabin with her boots damp and her hair loose from its pins. "There's a spring back there," she said, setting down a bucket filled with the clearest water Isaiah had ever seen. Cold as anything, he straightened from the half-built frame. "You found it?" She nodded. "I want to build a trough, maybe keep a few goats." His grin was quick and certain. "Then we'll build it." By early summer, the new room was ready, solid walls, A window cut to catch the morning sun and shutters, Adalline painted a soft, stubborn blue. She left a streak of paint across her cheek, and when Isaiah pointed it out, she laughed and told him to leave it. "It's proof I worked as hard as you," she teased. He let it be until that evening when he brushed it away with the edge of his sleeve as they sat by the fire. The rhythm of their life deepened. He taught her to load and clean his rifle. She showed him how to stretch cloth taut in a hoop for mending. When a fox got too bold near the chicken coop they'd built from scrap lumber, they sat up together on the porch until dawn, watching the shadows, comfortable in the shared vigil. One night as they walked the ridge, Adalline paused, pressing his hand against her belly. "There's a rhythm," she whispered, "like a bird's wings." Isaiah froze, then dropped to one knee, resting his ear against her. A small, steady beat thudded beneath his palm. "That's ours," he said softly, his voice breaking just a little. She knelt with him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "We'll raise this child here on honest land." He kissed her temple. "With your fire and my quiet, they'll learn everything that matters." That night, as they lay in the soft hush between the fire's last crackle and the first reach of dawn, neither spoke of the dangers behind them. Their thoughts were fixed on what was ahead, rooms to build land, to tend a life that was theirs alone. Preparing for the first winter and the arrival of their child. The first snow came early that year, tumbling down from a sky the color of pewter, quieting the land in a way only winter could. Isaiah had been watching the ridgelines for weeks, reading the signs in the wind and the sudden sharpness in the air. When the cold set in for good, they were ready, because they'd made themselves ready. In the weeks before, the two of them had worked side by side, stacking wood in neat cords against the north wall of the cabin until it rose higher than Isaiah's shoulder. He sealed the window frames with fresh caulking and laid a second layer of shingles over the weakest patch of roof. Adalline lined the shelves with jars of beans, corn, and root vegetables she'd dried or pickled, her hands busy from dawn until dusk. They traded with a trapper passing through for a bundle of thick pelts, coyote and rabbit that she sewed into blankets, the stitches tight and straight. The extra room they'd built over the summer had become more than just a place for storage. Isaiah had sanded a cradle smooth from juniper cut near the spring, the sweet resin scent lingering in the wood. He lined it with soft wool and carved her initials into the headboard, his knife cutting slow and careful, as though the act itself was a prayer. When Adalline first saw it, her hand went to her mouth, and her eyes shone in a way that made Isaiah's chest ache. As her belly grew, she moved a little slower but refused to stop working. He scolded her more than once for carrying buckets from the spring, but she'd only smile that stubborn smile and tell him, "I need to be strong when the time comes." He didn't argue, not much anyway, though he found ways to take the heavier loads when she wasn't looking. By midwinter, the cabin felt like a world of its own. Snow piled against the door, the wind howled over the ridge, and inside the fire painted everything in tones of gold and shadow. They filled the long nights with quiet conversation, hands brushing as they passed mugs of coffee or bowls of stew. Sometimes she would read aloud until her voice grew soft and the baby shifted under her hand, and Isaiah would sit listening, feeling as though the walls themselves were holding that warmth in place. When the baby came, it was in the deep hush of early morning, the snow still falling thick and unbroken outside. Adaline's breath came sharp at first, then steadied as Isaiah knelt beside her, his hands firm but gentle. Hours passed in a rhythm of effort and encouragement until at last a thin, strong cry split the quiet. Isaiah wrapped the child in a wool blanket, his big hands trembling as he placed her in Adalline's arms. She was small, with a tumble of dark curls and eyes clear as creek water. Miriam Adalline whispered, her voice rough but certain, "After my mother." Isaiah brushed a hand over the tiny forehead, the soft weight of her pressing into his palm. "You were always meant to be," he said, his voice low enough that only the two of them and maybe the land could hear. In that moment, the cabin, the ridge, the whole stretch of hard, beautiful country felt like it belonged to them in a way it never had before. It wasn't just shelter anymore. It was home. The years that follow and the peaceful ending, the seasons turned over and over the years, layering themselves like the rings of an old tree, each one marked by something they'd built together. Miriam grew from a wobbly-legged toddler chasing chickens into a sharp-eyed girl with hands quick enough to snap beans as fast as her mother. By the time she was 5, Adalline was teaching her letters at the kitchen table, the same way Isaiah had once been taught by an old army chaplain, with patient, steady repetition and the occasional smile when she got it right. Word of the Thorne family spread slowly through the scattered ranches and mining camps. Folks no longer spoke of the quiet man and the woman who once vanished, but of Isaiah and Adalline, who had turned a lonely cabin on the ridge into a place worth visiting. Neighbors stopped by with sacks of flour to trade for eggs, or to leave a sack of apples by the porch rail in thanks for a mended fence. Isaiah never said much about the help he offered, patching roofs, breaking horses, hauling water for those too old to do it themselves. But the territory remembered. The cabin itself changed with the years. Another cradle was carved when their second child, a boy they named Elias, came into the world during a wet spring that turned the whole valley green. Isaiah built a chicken house that didn't leak and a porch swing that matched the one Adalline had once dreamed aloud by the fire. The swing didn't creak. It moved with the breeze just as she'd wished. Life wasn't without its hardships. There were dry years when the garden struggled, winters when a fever kept them all inside for weeks, and once a fire that came within a quarter-mile of the ridge before the wind shifted. But each trial seemed to press them closer together, their lives knitted into something strong and unshakable. Miriam grew tall with her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet way of seeing a thing before speaking on it. Elias inherited Adaline's fire, quick to defend what he thought was right, and just as quick to laugh. On warm evenings, the children played in the yard, barefoot chasing fireflies, while Isaiah and Adalline sat side by side on the swing, their hands resting together between them. One such evening, the sun slid low behind the ridge, casting the cabin in a wash of gold. Adalline leaned her head on Isaiah's shoulder and watched Miriam spin in slow circles, her hair catching the last light. Elias darted past with a jar in hand, whooping as he caught another firefly. "This," Adalline said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years, "is the porch swing I wanted." Isaiah tightened his arm around her. "And it doesn't creak." She smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening. "No, it just moves with the breeze." They sat that way until the stars came out, the swing rocking, slow, the air cool and clean. The land around them was quiet, whole, nothing missing, nothing undone. They had built something from the dust and the dark, something no one could take from them. And in the deep, steady hush of that Arizona night it was enough.